Thanks everyone for coming out. It's a great pleasure to spend some time talking about something that's been a passion of mine for a long time. Um, I hate to count, but it's over 40 years now. Um, as Klaus said, I started collecting these stamps sort of late high school, early university, and once I discovered this area of collecting, I've never regretted it, and never found something even more interesting. So um, yeah, it's a great pleasure. Um, the appeal of these stamps, these are the very first postage stamps anywhere in the world, starting, of course, with the penny black and then evolving into the penny reds. One of the things that amazes me is the people involved in putting together not just the design of the first stamps, but the production processes and all of the infrastructure were so successful that nothing really changed for 40 years. The stamps were produced from the same or a similar master die up until 1879. There were some tweaks with the colors and the introduction of perforation and so on, but the basic format of the stamps didn't change for 40 years. And in fact, if you think about it, the stamps up in use up until today are actually quite similar to these early stamps. So it was an unbelievably successful process that was developed 180 years ago. During the 40 years of production of these stamps, the blacks through the reds, about 21 billion stamps were printed from 431 plates that were produced. As I worked on this presentation, I kept deleting things because I found there's so much to potentially talk about. It really is a rich area of philately and postage stamp history. So what I'm going to do tonight is hopefully provide a high level overview of the characteristics of these stamps over that 40-year period. And then talk about 6 categories that I use. They're not official categories in any catalog or anything, but in my own mind, as I think about the stamps and their place in the sequence of events, there's 6 sort of general categories with easily observable characteristics, and so I'm gonna talk about those and explain the sequence. I'm going to give a very quick overview of some of the opportunities to collect these stamps, what I call rabbit holes, very special, not necessarily specialized, but interesting collecting areas. And then finally, I've got some information about resources that are available to people who might be interested. Very quickly, the introduction of postage stamps, the culmination of a whole series of reforms that were going on in Britain, some of them related to the post office, others related to other areas of British culture and the economy. 4-pence uniform postage rates were introduced in late 1839. These were reduced to 1 penny a month later in January 1840. And then started the transition from recipient paid to sender paid postage, which ended up going on for almost 20 years. But that was the significance of the postage stamps, as most of us know, is that before that, postage was paid by the recipient of the letter or package, and the postage stamps allowed the postage to be prepaid, and the stamps were essentially a receipt for that payment. The reforms in totality, not just the postage stamps, but mainly the uniform rates, were so effective that the volume of mail doubled in the first year, 1840. The stamps were created were printed using a line engraved process, also called intaglio or recess printing. A master die was created, engraved in a block of steel, and this master die, which is in the British Postal Museum and illustrated on the right, that is the original engraved image that was the basis for all of the imperforate stamps, the penny blacks, the penny reds, and about and the first perforated stamps. So all of the imperforate stamps and the first couple of years of perforated stamps. At that point, the die was starting to wear out, so they re-engraved it. So arguably, the same die was used for all 40 years. The master die image was transferred to printing plates using transfer rollers, and the images were laid out on the printing plates in rows of 12, 12 representing 12 pennies to the shilling, and 20 rows, 20 shillings to the pound, so that post office clerks could very easily, when somebody came in and said, I want a shilling's worth of stamps or a pound's worth of stamps, that translated to a row or an entire sheet of penny stamps. So as I said, the design decisions that went into not just the stamp itself, but the way the plates were laid out and the whole process were remarkably effective. When the images were laid out on the plates, the lower corners of the images, if we go back quickly to here, you can see there's the letters A and I in the lower corners. Those are referred to as check letters. When the images are laid out on the plate, those squares are blank. So once the 240 images were laid out on a plate, somebody, and I like to think it was probably one of the apprentices, would then come along with a whole set of little punches and punch individual letters into those corners. And the illustration on the left is a box of these tiny punches that somebody found in the archives at the Royal Philatelic Society in London a number of years ago. And you know, again, this sort of idea that a lot of the decisions were made are still with us today. The recent introduction of the data matrices on modern British stamps are the rationale is exactly the same as those of punching these check letters on the penny stamps 180 years ago. It was to prevent counterfeiting, or at least create a disincentive to counterfeiting. The check letters were not random. Each row was assigned a letter, A through L, and each column, A through T for the rows, and the columns were identified A through L. So if you look at the block on the left, FA means row F, that is the sixth row, and column A is the first column. So you can actually, on multiples, see quite easily where it fit into the sheet. And you can see this sequence, FA, FB for the second column, GA for the seventh row, first column, and GB for the second column in that row. Not only do the check letters tell you where on the plate a stamp was printed, which of the 240 positions, because the letters were hand punched, each stamp is unique. The location and the orientation of the punched letter in the white box is sometimes extremely different, sometimes subtly different, but each, in this case, each stamp with ML as the check letters is different on the over 400 different plates that were used over the years. And in this case, you can also see some of the other differences. So when we try to plate these stamps, and by the way, plating is not something I'm going to talk about tonight because it's a whole subject on itself. So I want, if anybody came tonight expecting to learn how to do plating, I'm not going to cover that. I am thinking of doing a second presentation if there's interest in the new year specifically on plating, but it's not something I'm going to delve into tonight, which is probably a great relief for most of you. So plating is done not just on the basis of the location of these check letters, but there's other characteristics. You can see below the M, there's the remnants of a K. So in this case, and it didn't happen that often, somebody actually punched a K in that space and then came back and tried to rub it out with a burr and then punch the M over it, which was the appropriate letter for that location. You can also see along the bottom margin of the stamp under the word 1, there's a whole bunch of marks there, unevenness in the baseline, which is called burr rub, and which is also something that would be unique to the stamp. So every stamp printed from plate 21 in position ML would have these characteristics, the problem with the M over the K, and the problems along the baseline. And those are the sorts of features that are used to identify the plate that a particular stamp was printed from. The printing presses were manual. There's actually one still in existence in the British Museum in London, or is it the library? I can't remember. One of those institutions has one of these presses on display. Each press was capable of printing about 400 sheets per day. And keep in mind, this was in 1840, no electricity, no electric lighting. And yet they worked day shifts and night shifts with these things. The success was so great that they had to get the printers in and run 2 shifts a day to keep up with the demand for the stamps. As I mentioned, the first die, die 1, was engraved in early 1840, and it was used to produce about 210 of the over 400 plates that were ultimately created. Die 1 was used for all of the imperforate stamps and the earliest perforated stamps. By 1854, the die, which wasn't used for printing, but was used for creating transfer rollers to create the plates, the die itself was starting to show signs of wear. And so they went about creating a second die. And the second die was used until the end of the line engraved era in 1879. And here you can sort of see, you can see a comparison of the differences between the 2 dies. You can see, for example, that around the Queen's eye on the nose, die 2 shows up as a bit darker, and there's in this comparison 16 different points of comparison. This discussion relates to how eventually how to identify stamps. So the earlier penny stamps were printed from die 1 and the later ones from die 2, and the ability to distinguish between the 2 dies becomes key as you try to figure out what stamps you're looking at. One of the other differences that happens over time is in the alphabets. The tiny punches that were used to punch the corner letters themselves wore out and were replaced. And over the years, the typeface on the punches actually changed, and there were 5 distinct alphabets. And even within the alphabets, there were subtle differences between some, you might get 2 or 3 variations on the letter E or the letter F. But generally speaking, there's 5 different alphabets. The easiest to recognize is the last one, which is sans serif. The earlier ones take a little bit of experience, but they're not that hard to tell apart. Usually, the alphabet 1 are very compact. Alphabet 2 broader and heavier. Alphabet 3 they're now taller. And then alphabet 4 was only used on 2 plates. And for some reason, they decided on those 2 plates to hand engrave each letter on the plate instead of using the punches. I'm not sure why that was done, whether it was an experiment to see if they kept needing to buy new punches or what, but that's what was done. There were 2 watermarks used on the paper for these stamps. The penny blacks were printed on paper with small crown watermarks, and that continued in use until the mid-1850s. The bits that were used at the paper making plant, there'd be a screen of brass fittings that would be impressed into the wet paper to create the watermarks. The images of the small crown watermarks were apparently created by hand out of brass wire. The large crown watermarks that came later were stamped out of brass, so there's more consistency between the watermark images than there are with the small crowns. But notwithstanding, they're dead easy to tell apart. If you're looking at the watermarks, it's very rare that you'll have trouble telling the difference between the 2 types of watermark. One of the other things that happened over time was the earlier stamps had a chemical in the ink called prussate of potassium, which caused the paper to go blue. And sometimes the bluing is very subtle. sometimes it's quite spectacular, as you can see on this stamp. This is a security feature. And the thinking is it was done to deter attempts to remove cancellations. They were quite concerned about not creating circumstances in which people could remove the cancellations and reuse the stamps. I mean, the stamps are essentially money from the viewpoint of the government, the Treasury Department. So they put a lot of effort, you know, the check letter variation in the corners, and then the introduction of prostated potassium to prevent cancellation removal. In the mid 1850s, they stopped adding the prostated potassium, possibly as a cost-saving measure. One of the sort of side effects of the use of this is you get an effect called ivory heads, where the prostated potassium leaches out of the ink in the areas where there's ink on the front of the stamp, and you can actually see on the reverse the pattern of the stamp, the printed impression. And the large plate 37 image there, you can even make out the check letters EG in blue on white paper. The next thing to talk about is perforation. For the first 14 years of use of these stamps until 1854, most of the stamps were not perforated. Official perforation started in 1854. But before that, there was a period where they were testing an invention by a guy named Henry Archer, who came up with a way of perforating stamps and was given permission to test this out. And the stamps that were perforated by Henry Archer were actually sold. So they weren't just thrown away. They were actually used. And so these stamps do exist and are out there. But officially, perforation started in 1854, and then in perforation 16, and then in 1855 they started to produce perforation 14 stamps, because there were problems with the perforation 16 stamps being a little flimsy. One of the nice things about British stamps is because the British invented perforation, they set the standard for how you gauge the perforation. So a perf 16 stamp has 16 teeth across the top or the bottom of the stamp. And a perforation 14 stamp has 14 teeth across the bottom and top. I know this is true for the older stamps because they used comb perforators, which meant that they actually laid out the perforations so that there were actually 16 or 14 perforations per stamp. More modern stamps may not be quite as reliable in terms of counting or measuring the perforations. The Archer perforations were interesting, and to me, one of the most fascinating things is that how well this worked. This guy came up with this crazy idea of using tiny pins to punch holes in sheets of stamps at high speed, and it actually worked really well. And you know, the quality of the perforations in the Archer, so these date back to 1850. The quality of the perforation, if you compare it to the early perforated stamps of some other countries, it's remarkable how good these perforations are. Now, presumably, ones that were not so good were probably thrown out and not issued, but notwithstanding, the quality is very good. There are slight variations, and that's actually one of the ways we use to determine not only whether a stamp was perforated by Archer or officially perforated starting a few years later, but it's also a way of determining which of the 4 perforation sets of teeth that were developed were used for a particular stamp. So there were 4 perforators that were used, and we can tell by examining the pattern of narrow teeth and wide teeth. And to the right of the detail, you can see that one hole is shifted to the right and then it's followed below by a Y2. So these sorts of variations are consistent from sheet to sheet. So we can actually identify which perforator was used for a particular arch or stamp. The distinguishing feature of Archer perforated stamps is that alphabet 1 was used. So the SG letters on this stamp are from alphabet 1. The officially perforated stamps were all on stamps used alphabet 2 or 3 or later. So the Archers are unique in being perforated alphabet 1 stamps. And also, once you get into plating, the plates that were used for the Archer stamps were much earlier plates than were used for the officially perforated stamps 4 or 5 years later. Another area of collecting these stamps, another area of interest is the variation in cancellations, and I've just given a few examples here. The Maltese cross was used for the first 4 or 5 years, from May 1840 up until April or May of 1844. There are examples of it used later than that. In 1844, they came out with postmarks that actually identified the location of the post office that was used. So the two upper stamps are canceled with London postmarks, the chief office from Camberwell. The diamond cancellations, they're from the inland office apparently, and I'm not sure that they understand exactly what the numbers designate. They're not different locations. They might be different desks or different clerks within the inland office who are working canceling stamps. And then there's what are called the provincial cancellations. In other words, the non-London cancellations. England and Wales, where every post office was given an oval-shaped cancellation. There's an example from Manchester down below, 498, meaning that it's from Manchester. Scotland was issued with rectangular postmarks. The 139 identifies this as coming from Falkirk in Scotland, and Ireland was given, it's a little hard to make it out here, but it's a triangular postmark. And 290 identifies it as coming from Kinsale in Ireland. So the 6 categories, the 6 groupings that I lumped these 40 years of stamps into. The first one is obvious, the penny blacks, issued in 1840 and used only until about February 1841. So they were in use for less than a year, and printed from 11 plates. 68 million stamps were printed in that period, which again to me is remarkable given the technology they were using and the conditions they were printed in. That's a lot of stamps to print in less than a year. For each of these categories that I'm going to talk about, I've tried to lay out what I call easy characteristics, and then other characteristics, which are things which might take a little more work to figure out. So the easy characteristics of the penny black, obviously black ink. The corners have stars in the top, letters in the bottom. The paper is white. There are some variations. There's some on lavender paper. There's some on thicker paper, thinner paper. There's questions about whether that was just variation in quality from the paper mills or whether there were there were intentional experiments underway. The bluing of the paper doesn't come until the penny reds come along in 1841, when the prussiate potassium was added to the red ink. Penny blacks are all imperforate, and generally speaking, all canceled with Maltese crosses in red or black. There are examples of Maltese crosses in other colors. I know there's on eBay right now a penny black canceled with one of the later provincial cancellations, but all that means is that somebody found 4 or 5 years later, somebody found a penny black in a drawer and stuck it on a letter. So generally speaking, they're canceled with Maltese crosses. Small crown watermark, die 1, and alphabet 1 on all of the penny blacks. And I've also given the catalog numbers here, and I've done that for each of the categories. And so for the penny blacks, it's dead easy to figure out where they are in your catalog of choice. But for the later categories, it's a little more interesting. My intention is to take these summary tables and put them in a document. And I guess the club posts these presentations on the website. So hopefully I can provide a document that can be posted as well, which provides these summary details for each of these categories. The color of the penny blacks was chosen as part of the design process. The problem they had, whether it was real or perceived, there was a lot of political pushback on the stamps and public pushback on the stamps. So in a lot of areas, from people outraged at the idea of licking the back of a portrait of the Queen, to people convinced that the cancellation ink could be removed and the stamps could be reused. The red ink that was initially used to cancel the penny blacks was made by each of the postmasters who were across the UK who were dealing with these stamps, and so they were sent a formula, and there's a copy on the left of the notice about how to make the ink from printer's red ink, linseed oil, and the droppings of sweet oil. What resulted was a lot of variation in the consistency and the contents of the red ink, and so it looked like there might actually be instances where this red ink could be removed. So the decision was made to switch to commercially available black ink, which could not be washed off or scrubbed off the stamps. But the black ink didn't show up very well on black stamps. So the color change of the stamps from black to red resulted from the earlier decision, the first decision, to switch the cancellation ink from red to black. So this brings us to the second category, the penny red and perforated stamps. They started printing these stamps in late 1840, and then they were officially introduced, I believe, in February of 1841. They initially printed them using the same plates that the penny blacks are printed from, which are now called the black plates. And 7 of the penny black plates were used to print penny reds as well. By 1854, 171 plates had been created to print these imperforate stamps. The 4 stamps on the left give you an idea of the color variation. They're all red-brown, but there is some variation over time in the coloring. Again, they have stars in the top corners, check letters in the bottom. All of these stamps, all of the imperforate reds, are subject to bluing to some extent or another. Sometimes it's very subtle. Sometimes, as I showed you earlier, it's quite strong. They're, by definition, this category are all imperforate. For the first 3 years, they were canceled with the Maltese Cross. And then the 1844, the provincial and the London cancellations were brought in. Like the penny black, small crown watermark, die 1. Alphabet 1 was used for the first 131 plates, and then they switched to alphabet 2. And again, catalog numbers in the lower right. Category 3 begins in 1854 with the first officially perforated issue, but I sort of have to include the Archer perforations, the experimental perforations in this category. So by definition, the category is, the red perforated stamps, the beginning of perforation. So again, red-brown shades, there's no substantial change to the coloring of these stamps. Again, top stars, check letters in the bottom, blued paper still. Most of the perforation was with 16, but there was some perforation 14. used from 1855 onwards, and they're all more or less printed with or canceled with the 1844 cancellation. You can see on the left a matched pair. With the perforation 16 stamps, it is possible to find for some plates examples of the same stamp from the same plate, in this case ED from plate 162, used imperforate and then perforated 16. The perforation 14 stamps came along later and were printed from plates that were never used for imperforate stamps. Category 4 is, it's a catch-all. So starting in 1855, all heck broke loose. The master die was determined to be, showing signs of wear, and the decision was made to re-engrave it to create what was called, or what we now call die 2. In the Scott catalog, I think they just call it re-engraved. The paper, which had been blued up till this point, transitioned to white paper. They at some point in 1855, I believe, might have been 56, they removed the prussate of potash from the ink, and so stamps from that point on appeared only on white paper. The ink color started to transition from red brown to rose red, and to this day there's people trying to figure out exactly what happened. There was a fire at Perkins Bacon Printing Works, and they had to move to temporary facilities, and they lost a lot of their ink ingredients, and there's a whole drama that went on there. And ultimately, they ended up with a new color on the stamps. The perforation before this transition period had been generally perforation 16. By the end of this period, it was generally 14 with the occasional perforation 16 issue. The watermark was changed from small crown to large crown during this period. Not sure why that is. It may have had something to do with cost saving, not having to hand fabricate the small brass bits for the small crown, but using stamped brass fittings for the large crown. And the alphabet, during this period, the Czech letter alphabet changed from alphabet 2 to alphabet 3. So this is what you get. The catalog designations C3 through C9A are all from the Stanley Gibbons Specialized catalog. Some of these varieties are not even listed in Scott. And I think they're all listed in the regular Stanley Gibbons catalog, but I may be wrong. But there's the transition from C3, which is the first die 2 perforated stamps, through to C9A, which are starting to show the rose red color. You can see the transition from red brown through to rose red. And even on these images, you can sort of see the transition from blued paper in the first 5 or so stamps to a white paper on the right. And this is definitely the most challenging category to deal with. It's yeah, it's interesting. After category 5, we get what most are quite common stamps, and most people refer to as the red penny stars. So these are rose red. There are some shade differences, as you can see here, but for the most part, most of the stamps in this category appear in the dark rose red or the rose red of the 2 upper stamps. The vast majority of these stamps are perforation 14. There was an issue in perf 16 at one point because they were apparently doing maintenance on the perforation machines, and they dug out some old equipment to perforate for a few months. All of these are alphabet 3, except for 2 plates. As I mentioned before, they decided to hand engrave the letters on these 2 plates rather than using the punches, and those, because each letter is unique, are referred to as alphabet 4. And then here's the summary of the major characteristics of these stamps. The image on the left is from something Klaus mentioned that I was a very keen collector in my university days, and then I dropped it and came back to it. And one of the things I picked up in my university days was a reconstructed sheet. And I'll talk a bit more about this way of collecting a little further on. Because the check letters are unique, from AA in the upper left corner down to stamp TL in the lower right, it's possible without doing any plating to assemble a sort of a pseudo replica of a plate. And that's what somebody did with these category 5 stamps many years ago, and I came along and picked it up at a stamp dealer. So there's 240 stamps. I've just shown the upper left corner of it here. My point here is to show a bit of the shade variation that you get. You can see that they're all rose red, and they range from a darker color. Some of them are a bit faded, a bit lighter, but they're all absolutely not red brown. They're all in this rose red color. The final category, category 6, again, is a very well-known category. And when I tell people I collect penny reds, a lot of people assume this is what I collect. These are the 4 corner letter stamps. So these started being produced in 1864. They're still die too. They have all of the characteristics of the previous category of stamps, but with 2 important changes. As an additional security measure, they got rid of the stars in the upper corners, and they printed they printed the same check letters. And again, these are punched, but now with the alphabet 5 sans serif punches, and they flipped them. So stamp QG in this case has the letters GQ in the upper corners. And the other important thing they did was they started printing the plate numbers in the margins and the scroll work on each side of the stamp. So this is from plate 157, and hopefully you can make that out in the enlargement there. Those plate numbers, as far as I know, were hand engraved on 240 images on each plate. So there are some. I don't think they were punched. I think they were hand engraved. So there is some variation in the in those plate numbers. So these, when you start collecting penny reds, these are the ideal ones, because you don't need a PhD in penny reds to figure out the plates. So you can do it with a good magnifying glass, and looking for stamps that aren't completely obliterated with cancellations. These were in use. These were the last penny reds used. They were used until 1879, when Perkins Bacon lost the contract for the penny stamps, and it went to Delarue with a completely new design and a completely new printing technology, surface printing technology. But again, for 40 years, the same, essentially the same master die, the same basic design, the same printing process, the same way of, manner of plate production was used, which in my mind shows it was hugely successful. So again, the major characteristics: the top letters are now AA to LT instead of the stars. White paper, always perforation 14. There's no perforation variations in these stamps. Large crown watermark and alphabet 5. So this is a summary of the 6 categories. And again, what I'm planning to do is create a simple document that has all these tables in it. So if anybody's interested, they can get it off the club website, or we'll send out an email and people can contact me to get a hold of this stuff. So we get to how the heck do you collect this stuff? And there's just so many ways, so many rabbit holes, as I call them, that it's frustrating sometimes. You can't pursue all of them. So my own collection started with the desire to collect one stamp from each plate. Now, again, I'm not talking about plating tonight. We'll do that another time. But once you get into plating, there's ways of determining with the earlier stamps, up until the ones with the plate numbers engraved on the sides. there's ways of fairly easily establishing what plate a particular stamp comes from. It's just a matter of having the right resources at hand. So this is a page from my own um, collection that I started 40 something years ago. And these are examples from the black plate. So these are penny reds printed from the same plates as the penny blacks. Plates 3 and 4 were only used for penny blacks, as were plate 6 and 7, but all of the other penny black plates were used for penny reds. Plate 11 was never intended to be a penny black plate, but because of the success of this new prepaid postage scheme, the post office started running out of penny blacks. So they announced, or they decided internally to transition from the blacks to the reds in February of 1841, and post offices started contacting them and saying, we're going to run out of stamps. We don't have enough stamps to meet the demand. And so the plate 11, which had been created to print penny reds, was turned to printing penny blacks for a week or so. And so there were some number of plates that were sheets that were printed from that plate. And those are the stamps from that plate. The penny black stamps from that plate are extraordinarily rare. There's variations on collecting the plates. Some people try to collect, the same position. So you might choose the letters AA and try and get letters AA from each plate. Some people are fortunate enough to be able to collect their initials. My initials are PS, so there is no such thing as a position PS. I'm not able to do that, but I know there's one guy in the States who has a remarkable collection of penny blacks, all with his initials in the lower corners. Plate reconstruction is something I mentioned. So this is the full sheet of C10s that I acquired quite some time ago, and this is not actually a plate reconstruction. There's a copy of a stamp from each position on a plate, AA through TL, but they're not all from the same plate. So a plate reconstruction would entail finding stamps all printed from a particular plate and then trying to collect all of the 240 positions from that plate. And that's actually, it's quite ambitious, and it's quite an accomplishment when you're able to do that. There's 430 plates that were used in total. So if you do the math, that's well over 100,000 stamps you'd need to reconstruct each of the plates. So that's not something that many people would be able to tackle in their lifetimes. One of the other areas of collecting relates to multiple states of the stamps, particularly with the early plates, because they were, especially, plate 1A of the penny black is the one that most people know about. They produced this printing plate. The printing plates were made of steel, and they didn't harden the steel before they started printing from plate 1. And it wore out quite quickly. The stamp in the upper left here, you can see some signs of wear just above the K, just above and to the left of the K. So plate 1 wore out fairly quickly. They took it out of service. They had other plates on the go at the time, so they were able to remove it from service, and they repaired every single image on the plate. They re-rolled from the transfer rollers and fixed up the images by hand and got it back into service. So because in the case of that plate, the whole plate was repaired, they refer to the stamps as coming from plate 1A or plate 1B. All other plates, there may have been some number of stamps that were repaired, but no other plate has been given the AB designation. So the other 3 stamps are the penny reds. You can see signs of wear on them, particularly the plate 61 TA is showing a lot of wear. And so as a result, from time to time, a plate would be taken out of service, and somebody would go at it and repair particular positions on the plate. And there's now, because we've had 180 years to, to look at these things. Um, there's a lot of documentation of the repairs that were done and a lot of images available showing the differences between stamps from the same position that have been repaired. One of the interesting sort of side benefits of this is that there's bits of the early history of these stamps that can be recreated or revisited using these repairs. So as I mentioned, with plate 11, it was originally intended to be used for printing red stamps, and they put it into service printing black stamps because they were running out. This also happened with some of the other plates. So with plate 5, they switched it over to printing red stamps, I believe, in late 1840. And so they were printing red stamps from it. And then this problem arose where they were running out of the black stamps at the post offices. So they switched plate 5 back to printing black stamps. And then when they'd finally printed enough of those, it got switched yet again to the red stamps. So the second printing of black stamps from these plates is called the provisional issue. And the red stamps that were printed in the period between the original penny blacks and the provisional penny blacks are called pre-provisionals. Because of repairs that were undertaken on these plates over this period of time, it's possible for some plate positions to actually identify stamps that are red stamps that are pre-provisional and black stamps that are provisional. And in this case, I'm missing a couple here, but you can see for position QB, we have the original penny black, and then we have the red stamp QB, which is in state 1. It hasn't yet been repaired. And then repairs were done just before they put it back into service printing black stamps again. So the provisional black stamp would show some changes. And the fourth stamp or the fourth image in that row shows the state 2 red printing. And you can see that the check letters are weaker on that image than they are in the second image. And that's how we know it's a state 2. And then again, there's a state 3. So there was actually a third repair done to this plate. So it saw a lot of maintenance work done in its fairly short life. It was in use for less than a year. And the same with position SC in the second row. Because of the repairs that were done, we can actually identify stamps that were printed. Here we have a state 1 penny black. And again, just as an aside, you can see how difficult it is to quickly determine whether the stamp is canceled when there's a black cancellation on a black stamp. If a clerk is having to deal with hundreds or thousands of pieces of mail a day, it's a little harder to see the black cancellation on the black stamp, and that's why they switched to the red stamps. And then we have state 2, which is the provisional stamp here, which is there's some subtle differences between state 1 and state 2, and that's how we know the second penny black there is a provisional stamp. So as I say, there's rabbit holes with these issues, and dealing with repairs in the multiple states is a pretty substantial rabbit hole. Another aspect of collecting is to focus on the cancellations. Here we have some, I mentioned that there were some instances of different colors of ink being used for the Maltese crosses. There's a violet Maltese cross. It's not a particularly good one. You can clearly see the violet ink, but the actual image of the Maltese cross leaves a lot to be desired. There's a blue one on plate 27. And then there's location-specific Maltese crosses. The Maltese cross cancellations were handheld. It was a brass die with a wooden handle that was used, and all the postmasters across the UK were issued with these in early 1840. But of course, some wore out, some broke, and some postmasters took it upon themselves to have somebody local make them a new one. And so you get things like the Norwich cross there's a typo there, it's Norwich. On plate 33, that's a distinctive Maltese cross. The middle one there on plate 9 may be from Catterick in Yorkshire. I'm not sure. And then on the third one, on plate 35, it looks like there's a 1 in the middle of the Maltese cross. There were actually numbered Maltese crosses used in London, but this is not one of them. This is more likely the result of a pin or a nail coming loose in the middle of the cross. And there's indications of these on a lot of crosses. You'll see a little dot or a circle where there's a fastener coming loose in the middle of the cancel. One of the rabbit holes that I've kind of gone down is to look at postmarks used on plate 9 stamps. Plate 9 was sort of unique in that it was in use through 1840 and into 1841 for the black and the red stamps, but then they brought it back into use in 1843, and so there's identifiable cancels from that late period on plate 9 stamp. So it was a plate that was in use over a much longer period of time than most of the plates. Most of the plates would be used until they were deemed to be unrepairable and would then be formally destroyed. Plate 9 was around for at least 4 years. So the 4 stamps here show the sort of the 4 basic combinations: red on black, black on black, red on red, black on red. Red on red is quite an unusual and rare combination. You don't often see it. And then not only do you get those combinations, but as I mentioned, this plate was in use through to 1843. So the cancellation on the May 1843 stamp is a London numbered Maltese cross. It's got a 10 in the middle and a little cross sign on the top of the cancel. And we know that these cancels were in use in this early part of 1843. And then there's other identifiable cancels based on attributes of the cancellation. Manchester had a Maltese cross with a fishtail. It's got a deformation on the inner triangle of the cancellation that's quite distinctive. So there's an example of that in the upper left. The Leeds cross is identifiable, and this one was clogged with something when it was used. It's made quite a mess. Stirling in Scotland, there's a London number 1 cross there. And then Edinburgh had the Scottish Maltese crosses are a little different than most of the English crosses. And in Edinburgh, there was an evolution of the Maltese cross that was used for their cancellation. And there's 3 types. And again, these are all on plate 9 stamps printed from plate 9. And then there's on the right an example of a penny post cancellation in blue underneath the Maltese cross. The last area I just wanted to quickly touch on was perforation interest. The perforation process worked quite well, but it was quite demanding on the machinery. And every now and then, one of the little pins would get damaged or break, and it could they might notice it right away, or it might take days or weeks before they noticed it. So there's documentation that allows you to look for examples like this block, where you can see, if you look down the middle row of perforations, about 2/3 of the way down the stamp, there's a missing perforation. And then because of the technology that was being used, comb perforation, the same defect is repeated between the between the A and B columns on all the way down the sheet. So you see the same missing pin in the next row, and you'd see that in all 20 rows of that sheet. Resources. The Bible of this area of collecting is the Stanley Gibbons Specialized Catalog. It's been around, I think, since the early 1960s. It's something I had a copy of it when I was in university. I won't tell you which edition it was, but it certainly was nowhere near the latest. The the latest one came out just as I got back into collecting in 2021, and it's a miraculous document. It really is nicely done. Stanley Gibbons had assistance from a lot of the very specialized collectors of this material, predominantly in the UK, but there are others around the world, and they were quite open to feedback and including new information. And so that latest edition is quite good. The other book that I find very useful, and it's actually a plating guide, but it contains a lot of the background information to how the stamps were set up and printed, and even if you're not interested in plating, it's worth looking for a copy of it. And I know there's copies that come up on eBay, and I think I've even seen sort of scanned PDF versions of the book. It's by a guy named Litchfield. It was first published in 1949. I actually still use this book because it's got tables in it that allow for fairly easy plating of penny blacks. So if I go to a sale, you'll find dealers who have sometimes not pristine penny blacks, but penny blacks nonetheless, at reasonable prices, and it's possible to plate them using this book. But as I say, it has a lot of good background information about the creation of the plates and the history of the stamp. And then, the ultimate resource is the Great Britain Philatelic Society. They've been around for a long time, possibly even as long as actually, I don't think they're as old as the North Toronto Stamp Club. The Royal Philatelic Society is the one in England that's been around forever. Great Britain Philatelic Society, I think, dates back to the 30s or 40s. Anyway, they're an amazing resource, and a lot of the real expert collectors in this area belong to that group. They've published a lot of books over the years, and they have a huge amount of information on their website, including an online plating guide, which if I do a presentation on plating, I will be talking about that a lot. They have a newsletter and a journal, which has sort of scholarly articles on the latest and greatest on research into different areas of British philately. Postmarks, there are 3 books here that I use quite regularly. Collect British Postmarks is something I picked up in the 1970s, and it's still good. It's a really good overview of the Maltese crosses, but also the numbered cancels, and then railway and ship cancels, and everything else. Cancellations of the 1841 penny red is a good overview specifically of the penny red stamps. And Encyclopedia of the Maltese Cross is now 3 volumes, and it is a staggering detailed piece of work talking about the locational Maltese crosses, and including images of crosses on cover and so on. It's quite an amazing document. And then on the subject of perforation, this is a really good book. It came out about 15 years ago now, I think. I'm not related to Peter Sarjeant, so I have no vested interest in promoting this book, but it really is good, and includes, for example, documentation of all the known broken perforation pin varieties. And that's it. That's all I've got for tonight. Thank you for putting up with me.